Station Bellevue Fireman. Report to your station, KTRS 653. 551, this is 150, transmit. Naval Regis. 1350. Stand by. 100 at 150. See a 1300. Do you need more manpower on the scene?
When I left my house, I told my mother, my brother, my wife, I said, I'll be right back. We had been to Beverly Hills on many occasions, dumpster fire, maybe a light in a parapet, and they always called us, or maybe a small kitchen fire. In my mind, that's what we had here. And we responded. I was in a little utility van that we had at the time with a captain of mine and 2 firefighters. When we rounded the bend where you can visually see the building, my heart was in my mouth. I think I realized what it was, and subconsciously, but consciously no. I saw smoke coming out of the front to back, out of the eaves. Obviously, I knew we had a big fire. I saw people streaming out of that front, what will be called from now on the east side door. It was the front door, or near the stage. And I saw people getting out of there as we were driving down. So it didn't bother me at this point. It didn't bother me for perhaps next 20 or 30 minutes until I found out from one of my firemen that indeed there were people already dead when we arrived, and more people trapped inside.
First 45 minutes to the hour we were there, all we did was recover, try to get as many people out as we could reach because of the heat and the smoke come down on us pretty fast. At that time I found a crew. I believe it was John Brown was leading the crew. We went through the kitchen, do what we could. Most of the rescue was over. The building wasn't totally evacuated, or the firefighters weren't called out of the building. There was still some suppression going on, but pretty much the rescue effort. I can recall looking around the back, and the only thing I can compare it to, it just looked like a war scene, something like that I'd seen on television, with just the bodies laying around. And I didn't focus too much on that, really. I just wanted to fight some fire at that time.
Heard the house siren go off, so I said, let's start mosey on back to the house and back to her house and find out what's going on. It wasn't 15, 20 seconds after that I could hear the city of Newport responding, all units, and they had about 4 units screaming up the street, and we were looking down into Newport at that time, and so we picked up our pace quite a bit back then. I called the house, and the only words my mother said on the other end of the telephone were, Mark, Beverly Hills is on fire and there's people trapped.
I immediately went to the back of the building with Captain Braun at the time. We did work in the garden area. I was a cadet at the time. I was not permitted to go in the building or so I was stationed at the back doors, assisting in any way with the bodies or what have you.
I took a walk around the back, caught up with my dad up front. He was okay, but just told me to go find my brothers and make sure they were okay. Found one brother at the back door, assisting there, and found another brother in the chapel with an oxygen mask on him. I thought he was, it didn't look good at first. I kicked him in the side, he opened his eyes, so. And the third brother was also in there with him. They took a blow and got some oxygen, but they couldn't keep them. If you know these guys, they weren't in there for 5 minutes. They snuck out.
I was going through trying to get identification. I remember one of the guys was like a president of one of the steel companies. I think it was Armco Steel or something like that. And then I went on down the line, and I guess if anything really affected me, I came across a young lady, looked to be in lower 20s, inner 20s, and looked to be about 9 months pregnant. and I guess if anything really bothered me and upset me, it was that. It just, I was sick for 3 days because of that.
We went to work up on the roof area. We went to work in the main lobby of the area with a 2.5, like John said. We drug a 2.5 through the main lobby because that's when by that time the roof was coming in from the inside and there was a lot of fire visible. So we dragged a 2.5-inch line through the main lobby of the building and was doing some heavy work in that area there. And then we eventually got to the roof and pulled some fake siding off that they had covered the old windows of the old building. And we got through there, and we could see all the way through in through the crystal room and the other rooms that was on the second floor, which by that time was a lot of fire.
And I never will forget this, and I don't mean to sound gross about it, but I stepped on something and it squished. And I, not being able to see without my glasses, I had to get down on top of it, and there was a stack of bodies. And there was a young firefighter with me named Greg Hirsch, and everything that I had ever learned or had ever taught at fire training about strategy or about search and rescue went out the door. No fancy carries. Grab whatever you could grab and start carrying. And I was probably in there for the length of one air bottle. There was no more to be found. I think I might have pulled out 4 people. Could not tell you to this day if they were dead or alive, although I suspect they were dead. And we took them to the door, the same as Mike O'Day's crew did, and handed them off, and they brought him down.
When I left him, I went to the rear of the building, and I was virtually alone. When I turned the corner, it hit me at that time just what we had. I first saw in the dark, I was all alone, bodies, dead bodies, that had already been recovered and placed neatly in stacked rows. I don't know who did that to this day. Mm-hmm. Somebody had the decency and respect and the time, I might add, to place those bodies head to head, side by side, about 2.5, maybe 3 rows. Mm-hmm. And these people were all dead.
When you looked at the fire coats, all the different initials, it wasn't all SFD or FTFD or NFD, which is Fort Thomas, Newport, Southgate. They were all over. One other thing that had happened, I had been in front of the building, and as I said, I worked for fire service training, so I knew most of the firefighters in 7 counties. Mm-hmm. And a truck came up the hill from Warsaw, Kentucky, which has got to be 50 miles. And this was like 45 minutes into the fire, and I know their chief, and he was probably going about 110 miles an hour. And they were riding a tailboard. And he said, he knew me, and he said, "John, I've got 6 EMTs, and I got oxygen. Where do they need me?" And I said, "Around back." I had not been around the back, so I really didn't know what was going on. All I knew is that Chief Riesenberg, and they had said they had problems in the back, they needed the oxygen in the back. And that fire crew, they dropped their pumper, picked up their equipment, and off they went. Mm-hmm. And but basically the rest of the evening, it was morning before I actually got around to the back of the building to see the. I'm kind of like the other people that were in front of the building. We knew we had a serious fire. I mean, obviously we knew that, but the magnitude of it, I don't think really hit me until, as Chief Riesenberg says, you go to the back of the building and you see what's there. So that was basically. I did take a crew, which included, well, now Chief Daly and some other young ones. And I need to say this one thing. When we started the cadet program down here, the chief, and I don't remember which chief it was Chief Minch, gave me that task. And I will say this, the young guys that came up to the cadet program, many of them today are career firefighters. Some are fire chiefs. Mm-hmm. And that night, even though some didn't go in the building, some did, even though they weren't supposed to. And I will say they all did a heck of a job, those young guys. And they were affectionately sometimes called the Kitty Corps, but they worked their tails off. And I was personally very proud of them. I know the chiefs were. And I did want to mention that fact because I think that's one thing that is sometimes overlooked. These young guys, 16, 17 years old, and even the ones that were 21 that had been through the cadet program, as Mike O'Day said, they grew up that night. Mm-hmm. We all grew up a little bit that night.
They were kids. Mm-hmm. And they're men today. They were men after this fire.
In my words, I think it strengthened the department, if anything. The department came out a much stronger organization than what it was before, physically And it might sound funny, but even mentally, you know, they had more on their, they could take more after that. I mean, this was the ultimate test, you know.
It affected all of us a little bit differently. I mean, it affected some, as Chief Ken Nipper from Silver Grove had mentioned earlier. The night after the fire, 6 of his people came back to the firehouse, hung their gear on the rack, and never came back, which is a story I'd never heard before. But I know there were other places where people were strongly affected by this. I think the department as a whole, which was a big blow to the city, obviously, and I think the citizens, and really the larger community of northern Kentucky pulled together. One thing's for certain, we never lacked for food up there.
Whenever there's a tragedy, you have to get something positive out of it. And with this, you know, with the tragedy here, a couple things came about. Number one, I think it took this type of fire to realize that this type of magnitude of a fire can happen in any city. I think maybe up till then, you know, we looked at in New York or LA, big cities, you know, where they have these magnitude of fires, not small cities and that. Well, as soon as this fire happened, you know, we realized this can happen to anybody. You know, whether you're in New York City or you're in a little hamlet in, you know, southern Kentucky, it can happen. And with that, probably the best thing that came out of it was code enforcement. Up until then, inspectors probably were trained, as John would say, you know, on minor things. What brought about, this brought about was significant changes in the fire marshal's office, a working relationship with the firemen themselves and with our fire inspectors.
I was probably, well, according to the reports you read, I was actually probably the last person that supposedly had a chance to avert this tragedy by inspection. But to be very, very honest with you, I was really somewhat ignorant. I had been taught by a former assistant chief down here who was into prevention. We did what we thought we were doing. At that time, these larger buildings were under the jurisdiction of the state fire marshal, which was then part of the Department of Insurance. We did not have a close working relationship with them. In fact, I'm not even sure who the inspector was at the time. But I had been to this building. I'd been to the building with Chief Riesenberg. We were in there, I believe, when they were working on the cabaret room. And the actual plan was that all of this was supposed to be reviewed by the state. And we went through and we looked for the very obvious things. We looked for fire extinguishers, we looked for exit signs. We looked for things that are very, very obvious. If you ask me, could have I calculated occupant load? No, I couldn't have. Or how many units of exit width there were in this building? Today I can. I am in fire prevention today. But at that point in time, I was almost flying by the seat of my pants.
Was I prepared for it? Probably. I think any firefighter who makes it all the way to chief knows that it can happen, hopes that it does not, of course. Can one person do a better job than another? Sure, that's human nature. We did a swell job, I think. But in my particular case, I was very much interested in listening to John and Chief Minch. The city was wonderful. Sure, what they said was true. In my spirit, and I don't want anybody to say, oh, poor Dick, that's not the point. In my particular case, this fire broke my spirit. I lost my family as a direct result of this. I was depressed and turned to alcohol in a big way for 3 years. I had to seek psychiatric help. It helped me. I finally made a life for myself. But to do that, I had to take some advice from professional people, advice that I did not want to do. I loved it here. I loved this fire department. I loved this city, and I loved my family. But to make a clean break and a new life, you have to get away from it. And I finally, reluctantly, in 1980, moved out of Southgate. And I must say, although I love these people in this great little community, I have never looked back. I can't look back. I've built another life. And memories, oh my, certainly good memories, bad memories. But I guess the part that broke my spirit was the fact that for years I felt responsible for the death of 165 people. And again, professional people assured me that it was not my fault. This was an act of God, and these things happen. It was not an individual's fault. It was not a fire department's fault. I think because of the efforts of everyone in this room and people who are not here today, only 165 people died. Many more could have. So with that in mind, you know, I think we had a success.
As was stated before, the Southgate Fire Department's been around a long time and has a good reputation, a very good reputation throughout this part of the state and also throughout this part of the state and throughout the entire state. But as far as the future, I think we're talking in the lines of code compliance and public fire education, and that is the most important thing today. It's not the $500,000 or $1 million fire trucks running up and down the road that have, I believe, more than halved the fire deaths in this country in the last 20 years. It's the updating of the codes, and it's getting people to apply the codes, and it's the public fire education.